Hello, today I am joined by my guest Tony Hill from Complete ASAP. Tony, how you doing?
I'm good, David. Thanks for having us, and good to see you as always.
A happy National Estate Agent Day to one and all. Um, we're
Absolutely.
we're dating this recording, 26th of February. Put it in your diary. That's National Estate Agent Day. Um, Tony, we were talking just off camera there. Today we're talking about a subject that has become much more spoken about. And it's the differences between sort of leasehold and freehold transactions and how they're handled. And I was relaying to you just one story about, a solicitor that I'd come into contact with, and every solicitor I come into contact with says, "Oh, could you refer some clients to us?" And you say, "Oh, yeah, 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 sure." And you have that sort of chat. And I would ask them, "Well, what's your speciality? Is it large transactions? Is it bigger clients? Do you do portfolios?" And the response came back that they'll touch anything quite happily as long as it's not leasehold. And I thought to myself, well, I'm 30 years into a career in a state agency. And in my neck of the woods, particularly around here in the northwest, as you'll know, in the north of the country, if we were to say we weren't dealing with leasehold properties, I don't think I'd sell a thing because more often than not, there's a legacy, isn't there, of the system that we've all inherited. There's some very long leaseholds out there. So I think there is a lot of anybody listening to this will know there is a lot of, I suppose, there's an education piece that we need to do because there's a lot of ignorance about the nuances in leasehold. What is the difference between a regular sort of long leasehold on a, say, two-bedroom terrace house and a leasehold on a high-rise flat is very different. And what the leasehold reforms all mean. So I've got a ton of questions to throw at you. But perhaps maybe we can start, which is from somewhere which I know you're real experts on. Maybe you could sort of tell us what you feel are the key differences between the conveyancing processes between a leasehold and a freehold property.
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, I won't bore you to tears with my history, but obviously I was a conveyancer for a while. And I mean, the key difference is as freehold, you own the land and everything on it. You don't have somebody, so when you're doing a conveyancing transaction, you're focused in on the title documents, the searches. It's a more condensed review.
Yeah,
With leasehold, you effectively own the right to occupy a property for a time barred period. And therefore, there's far more restrictions against what you can and can't do within that property. But obviously, over time, through tragedies at Grenfell and other things, legislation started changing, which has meant that from a conveyancer's perspective, the amount of things they're now having to check further to what the previous is just growing and growing and growing. So if you consider things like, fire risk is obviously a very big one now. So goes back to your high rise comment.
yeah.
But there's simple things like budgeting. How's it being managed? Is there enough money in there to make sure that the building's just being maintained? Are they actually charging decent service charges and grants, or they're ripping people off? Because there's quite a lot of that goes on. So,
Yeah.
I suppose from a solicitor's perspective, it's they're carrying a lot more risk on leasehold properties, and they stay in your pipelines longer. There's a lot more to do. So that's probably why you've got a solicitor friend that's not as keen on them being there
Yeah.
because is the value on them probably doesn't stack up as much.
Yeah, no, it's sort of pound for pound in terms of the time as well that it takes back and behind sort of the issue of leasehold properties you mentioned there is the management of these buildings, raising inquiries with those managing agents as well, particularly in blocks of flats. That's a knowing smile, Tony. I could tell you've
It
been
is.
there before, but that can hold up chains for a long time. I mean, I lose track of the amount of times I've chased a chain and somebody's come back to me to say, "Oh, we're still waiting on the management company to issue their report and answers to those inquiries," and it can really slow things down, can't it?
And that's if you're lucky enough to only have one of them involved, because
Yeah,
sometimes properties have someone looking after service charge, then someone dealing with ground rent and buildings insurance. Sometimes it's two companies that happen to be on the same buildings and know each other quite well
yeah,
that tend to not be that quick. But I suppose I'm leading into sort of what we can do about these things. I mean, the reality is a management pack has an expiry date to it to a point. So you can't just order it straight away
Yes.
and hope you're selling a certain amount of time, because the cost they can be quite expensive. So obviously if we did that and then it didn't sell, you could potentially cost your client twice. But there's no reason you can't find out who these people are, have a conversation with them. It's quite funny when you ask them if they do an expedited service, they're quite quick to tell you they'll do it for an extra £100. But if you don't ask the questions, you don't find out. And that preparation alone, just having a telephone number to speak to somebody on, sometimes getting the seller to actually do it themselves and actually pay for it direct. Because, I mean, I'm not going to slate solicitors. I've got a lot of love for them, but some of them still send out a letter to find out how much it costs and wait for that to come back. So that you're losing time in logistics, if nothing else.
Yeah.
So I think for me, there's things that can be done, but yeah, the management companies have been a very big sticking point for many a year.
So in terms of, agents that might be watching this, because we read the papers as much as everybody else does, and there's always sort of headlines about leasehold reforms, and the government are working hard at trying to sort of um, reform the way that leasehold transactions work, and the unfairness, if you like, of some of those particularly the newer build leaseholds as well. People got taken advantage of with respect to the length of leases and the amount of, if you ever needed to extend them, and also the service charges and the ground rents that were doubling, all this sort of stuff that was compounding away there in the background. So it became a very murky field for a while. And unfortunately, I think a few opportunistic people stole all those headlines and kind of, and the narrative then became, well, leasehold is toxic and it needs cleaning up. What is that update about what's happening with those leasehold transactions and government reforms? Are we making headway with that?
Well, having spoken to quite a few of the solicitors we work with on this, I wouldn't say we've got a common view on what these reforms are going to achieve. I think just to sort of pull back a little bit, so it's the Renters' Rights Act that everybody's aware of, obviously from a letting side of things. But what it's doing, I think it comes in May, the next step. The impact it's going to have is, so you mentioned about the doubling ground rents, and that's been a bone of contention for the last few years. There's been lots of deed of variations done to correct that, because the old law would have allowed a lease to turn into effectively a tenancy agreement under old land law, which meant that people could serve Section 8 notices if rent wasn't paid, which is obviously a risky situation. Lenders wasn't happy with it, etc., etc.
No.
Now, because the Renters' Rights Act is going to change that so that anything over 7 years cannot become a tenancy agreement. So it removes that ground rent trap effectively. So a deed of variation for that particular point should, and I'm saying should very carefully here, not be as required. However, the solicitors I'm talking to they need lenders to follow suit. So you're obviously aware of the UK Finance Handbook that the conveyancers have to adhere to. So each lender has a particular viewpoint on certain things, and they're not uniform. Now, when you're buying a property, you might have a lender that your particular buyer's using, but you've got to, as a conveyancer, consider that when they come to sell the property, the buyer may use a different one. So you've got to try and cover the array of lenders. Now, the issue with that is, until the lenders follow suit and say that this isn't the issue that it was, solicitors will continue to have to lean into those lenders to find out what they're happy to lend on and what they're not.
Yeah.
So we've got some that are now using indemnity to cover the gaps. I think it's May the 1st that this bit comes in. So some are now using indemnity to cover it. Some are still doing it. And I am finding that that consensus hasn't landed yet. But in theory, this should save on a lot of properties, the lengthy process. I mean, a deed of variation, I've seen them taking months and months of delayed transactions. That should happen quickly. On new properties, they're not allowed to. I think they say they have to be peppercorn rents on longer ones. Less leasehold houses are coming in through new build, things like that. So there's lots of reform that will happen and will make a difference. But it's how quickly will it make a difference? You've still got lots of legacy leases. You've still got lots of things that are going to have to wash through. So I think I'm sort of cautious that it's going in the right direction, but I don't think anyone can sit here. There's no silver bullet coming. Is where I'm at, and I think we can still look at how can we approach leasehold in the right way, and how do we manage it best in our pipelines.
Okay. Well, I'm going to invite you to answer that question precisely, but let's look at what the agents can be doing, I suppose, as that first port of call. How how should agents be approaching leasehold transactions? Should they actually be? So we hinted at the fact that solicitors are charging more for handling leasehold transactions because there's more involved in that process. It can take longer. Um, do you feel that estate agents should be charging more? Is there more heavy lifting for agents to do in marketing these things, or actually, in effect, would we be charging a fee for the fact that we have to wait longer to see that our fees come through at the end of the pipeline?
I suppose that's a commercial decision for any particular agent, but if you consider the fact that most agents work on a no sell, no fee basis, I mean, I don't have any stats to say this, but I would say because of the more risks being reviewed in a leasehold transaction, the chances of fall through is probably higher.
Yeah.
And like you say, from our stats over the last 3 years, freehold have been pretty standard, stayed around 100 days, and it's been pretty much the same. Leasehold has increased significantly. It's now about 7 weeks longer than a freehold transaction on average, and that's over thousands of transactions. So it's whether it's fully reflective of the market, I think it's a big enough sample size. And I think of all properties in the country, about 20% are leasehold. So it's significant that these could be in your chains effectively quite often. And I think that there is more work agents can do. It doesn't need to be too much heavy lifting, but it's back to preparation. And I think, do we differentiate between freehold and leasehold as to what we do? I think it's the same premise. It's doing the preparation work because the solicitor's jobs, I think we all know, a buyer's solicitors can only review information once they have it in front of them. So it's back to how fast can you get that relevant information in front of them. We've already touched on the management packs. That's obviously one of the keys. How quickly can we get that? Now, one thing I would advise any agency, so you mentioned obviously in your local area, there's lots of leaseholds.
Yes.
Now, you're going to sell lots of the same properties in the lots of the same developments. Actually, record somewhere who those management companies are, build a relationship with them, find out how you can get things done with them quicker. Because the solicitors that work on those jobs, as you know, conveyances become more national. Your
Yes.
buyer could have just gone online and got a conveyancer from somewhere completely random that has got no idea who looks after that development. So your knowledge there can really, really help. Again, you will then be able to record what the costs are, things like that. So you can prepare a seller. So that's a big thing as well. Advising a seller of what to expect, the amount of times, and this is even going back to when I was conveyancing, they're not wanting to pay for the management packs because they weren't aware that they were maybe going to have to pay 300, £350. Why
Yes.
am I paying this?
Yeah.
I'm selling, because they're not aware of it, they push back against it. So,
And
no,
that
it's legal.
and that all takes time, doesn't it? To sort of,
Yeah.
okay, well, I'm pushing back against it. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Vendor, this is why you need to pay for it. Or if there's something the buyers need to pay for, you need to explain that. It's all time, isn't it?
It
It's the
is.
agent's time, and it takes more time out of that
It's letting
transaction.
people know what they're in for. It's expectation management ultimately. I mean, if you get a copy of a lease and you realise it's a short lease, well, you can be having a conversation. Do you want to market it to cash buyers and realise that you're not going to get as much money? Do you want
Correct.
to go? Do you want to go and get a lease extension? Let's start that process. Do you
Yeah.
see? So
Yeah.
unless you know exactly what it is, you're starting different things at different points. And I mean, the age-old things of get a specialist leasehold conveyancer, get them as early as possible at the listing stage. Speak to your client. Just ask the question of the client: who do you pay your ground rent and service charge to? Oh, it's such and such a firm. Have you got a telephone number for them?
Do you know?
It's really simple little things that, and I get it. Agents are so busy, you don't necessarily have time to process these things out and think about it, but it does bite you down the line.
But this is what we were talking, we were talking sort of tongue in cheek about National Estate Agent Day, and I mentioned to you that, we're not appreciated enough. But if you think about it, when we talk about why estate agents make a difference in a transaction, it's not just because we sort of, move bits of friction around from one place to another and say, oh, I've spoken to Tony and he's doing this and I'm just letting you know about it. We're more than just sort of a conduit for communication. We can be proactive and we can actually sort of help. And if you think about the advice that we give to estate agents about marketing, sometimes to become that sort of mayor of your area where you get to know everything about your area, become that kind of mayor of your marketplace in as much as if you deal with a lot of leasehold transactions and you know that the management companies on these blocks that you end up selling flats in 3 or 4 times a year are the same people, well, don't just treat it as a kind of a one-off. Keep it as part of your records and as your Bible, your knowledge of the area. And I think you're right, Tony. I think that then allows you to really add value and also speed things up because if you've got a new face as a conveyancer in the chain where they don't know any of this information, you can start off by saying, hey, really great to have you on board with this. I'm now going to tell you who the management company is, who to email if you need information because they're most responsive. And these are the sort of almost like FAQs for different blocks.
Yeah, but I'd also say for the agency, I go back to your question about should agents charge more for it? Well,
Yeah.
if you work in a particular block and the last one you've just done has taken a dreadful amount of time because the freehold is poor or that you need to have a deed of variation because the lease isn't drawn. Because when you have a block of flats, for example, leases have to be drawn on similar terms. So across leasehold, you get different. The leases are not standardized, but they
Yeah.
have to be within a block to ensure that all the people have got fair regulations. Okay. So if you deal with one development, the leases will all be drawn in similar terms. So if you sell one and it's a defective lease that needs to be altered and changed, the next one you sell is likely to be the same. And do you see
Yeah.
what I mean? So
Yeah.
understanding that at the beginning, I would say, well, if I know that's going to be the case, I want a little bit extra on this deal. I want to make sure I'm charging correctly
And
for it.
and I suppose it also makes a good case for that material information point that we all know is our obligation anyway to get as much information out of people at the beginning of a transaction as possible. But with leasehold transactions, you very often find that the bits of information you get are, the headlines, if you like, but then it all sort of comes out when you get the management packs later on. But I suppose the more upfront work we're able to do, the better we're able to sort of go into those transactions with a bit of
Yeah, I mean,
momentum.
the standard material information, I think it's around ground rent, isn't it? You've got to have
Yeah,
length of lease, ground rent, service charge. Now, that's obviously the personal information that a buyer's going to really care about. But if I said to you, well, David, your service charge is 250 quid a year, that's great. Ground rent's tenner a year. And then you find out 9 weeks later that your seller's not told you that there's been a Section 20 notice served and it's going to cost them another 15 grand for a new roof. Well, there's your deal breaker.
yeah,
It's not your other bits.
yeah,
So as much as you can glean, even just through conversation with your seller, have you had this? Have you had anything? It doesn't necessarily need to be from the management company. It's finding out more from the seller. So
yeah,
that it's always back to that age-old thing. If you don't want to find out on week 9 or week 10 because you've expended so much energy, you've not been paid a penny and you've lost your buyer.
yeah.
It's about what do you think is going to be a deal breaker? And I think finding as much of that out as possible is whether it's freehold or leasehold is always important.
Really interesting. So there are other sort of nuances to the whole freehold and leasehold question. So, for instance, there's the confusing phrase share of freehold, and so how does that sort of differ to leasehold in practice?
Well, I think there's a misconception, let's say. So the amount of times I've had people send us a share of freehold job thinking it's a freehold job, is way too many, quite frankly. Share of freehold is still leasehold, and if anything, you've got more work to do because
Right.
you've still got to review the lease as a leasehold property, but you're now also dealing with the transfer of the share of freehold, and sometimes that could be held in a management company, so it's as simple as a share certificate transfer.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's named people on the title. Then you've got to find the other person to do an actual transfer. So if they don't live in the property and they're renting it out, you've got to deal with that side of it.
Because sometimes there are not always management companies, are there, in those
No, so
situations?
so
It
the
can be
freehold could be
individuals.
the
Yeah.
freehold could be me and you, David, for
Yeah.
example. And you could live somewhere lovely like the Maldives, but you've rented it out, and I can't then find you, and I can't get you to sign a document to transfer that over. So
Yeah.
people started creating corporate structures to have shares, and it makes it much easier to transfer shares than it does getting someone to sign a transfer deed, for example. But I think that's one sort of myth around the Sheffield. But obviously, there's the benefits as well. So if there's then been a breach of the lease, well, obviously you've only got one other person that can basically hold that against you, and it's sort of potentially mutual destruction to a point. In that, if there's me and you as the things, and I don't know, I've put a carpet in my flat and I shouldn't have been able to,
Yeah.
then if you were to then obviously collaborate with me, I'm then going to be hypersensitive with you as well. So generally, what happens in those circumstances, the freeholders are very clear, and they may alter the leases. They may get it so that how they want it. But I think the advice you would give on a freehold on a share of freehold is not too dissimilar to what you would give on a leasehold anyway as a conveyancer, because you've got to cover all bases. And unfortunately, as conveyancers, you've got to look at the worst case scenario, not the best case. So even if the other freeholder's the greatest person on the planet, it might not always be them.
Yeah.
So you've got to look at what could happen.
That makes sense. I was hoping you wouldn't tell me that, but I now know that.
Unfortunately,
I
yeah.
know that my experience matches yours as well. So and we touched briefly on Grenfell, and one of the things that is the legacy of such a tragedy like that is that obviously there's a very human legacy to it all. But it's also had a knock on, and that should never be minimized. And this conversation doesn't attempt to do that. But there is also a knock on effect to an entire marketplace who were affected. Anybody that had flats and build, and there were tons of buildings that had cladding on it. There were tons of flats that go over a certain number of stories where the legislation then applies. For a while, we had lenders refusing to send out valuers. We had surveyors that were refusing to attend because they needed to have certain expertise in that area, and for a while it was being pushed as this is somebody else's problem. It's a government problem. They need to fix it. And so there have been it's been quite a fraught marketplace, really.
Yeah.
Those lovely, shiny, new build, high-rise flats that were the talk of the town were on the way up suddenly became a weight around investors' necks because they couldn't refinance, they couldn't move them on, and for a while as agents, we found ourselves with our hands tied on it, and it was a really unfortunate situation. There's a sense that has eased and that we've now got a bit of perspective on it and a bit of ownership as well. So the key parties are now saying, okay, well, we know what to do. We've got a framework and we can work to it. So does leasehold in practice these days still sort of differ based on property type between sort of flats and houses and the height of the buildings? Is there still that kind of tension there?
Absolutely. So again, northwest, you get lots of freehold houses. Sorry, leasehold houses. So that's a very different circumstance. So if you've got a leasehold house, chances are your lease will make you, as the leaseholder, responsible for all the maintenance,
Yeah,
and your obligations will be more about just paying ground rent and insurance, and it's lighter touch, let's say,
yeah,
as to what you can and can't do. Whereas you talk about the high rises, they're still obviously caught under the BSA regulation. And you mentioned about surveyors and other people. So the lenders were a big part on this in terms of what they were willing to lend against. And what we've seen in the sort of conveyance market is it's become a specialism. We tried to actually get network lawyers together to try and find out who was willing to do BSA work and who wasn't. And it was frighteningly high, the people that weren't willing to take it on because they think there's a potential risk down the line. Now,
yeah,
whether that's true or not, I can't comment. So when we did then find some firms that are leaning into this, they're charging accordingly, but they have done lots of extra training around it. So now it's a specialised area. My advice to anybody that is in an area with this is find one of these specialist lawyers, because I have seen other firms that have, charged an extra few £100 and had a go at it, let's say, and the delays attributed to that have a go attitude has been quite significant, as opposed to somebody who knew
Yeah.
exactly what they were doing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And this is where I know this is informational, Tony, and you're not here to sell anything to anybody today, but I can say this. This is where companies like yourselves are worth their weight in gold, because you've asked these questions up front. So if I throw one of those transactions at you, you won't be scrambling around trying to find me somebody that can deal with it. You'll already know, who's going to deal with it, how's it going to be dealt with. And I think that kind of is worth its weight in gold. You don't want somebody who's going to be a have a go hero, and then add another 8 weeks to a transaction further on down the line. And in some cases, it's not unheard of representation to change mid-transaction because somebody got frustrated and said, right, well, I'm moving it on to somebody who can help me.
Well, funny enough, this goes back to the agent as well. So, identifying whether it falls under BSE is quite interesting. So, there are people that have not necessarily recognised that. They've sent it off to their recommended firm, because why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And then the recommended firm have turned around after so many weeks in investigation. Sorry, we don't act on this. So, like you said, that in itself can cause delay because it hasn't been identified at the earliest point. The solicitor's identified it. I don't want that risk, passed it out, and then they've had to find someone else and start again.
Well, I think I think the reassuring point after all of this is that I think the future is that leasehold might become less complicated, and it might become less onerous in certain cases. It's certainly not going anywhere in terms of it's not going to disappear entirely, and we're gonna have the legacy of this long held system of freehold and leasehold to deal with for quite some time to come. They can be sold. They can be moved on. It's just a matter of knowing the right people and asking the right questions up front. And I suppose managing it accordingly. So that when I go out and see a prospective seller and we're talking about marketing their property, at that point we can say, look, it's going to be a little bit more complicated. This might take a little bit more time. This is what we might recommend you do up front. And I think if we can manage it and manage those expectations in that way, surely then that makes for a smoother transaction all round.
Absolutely. Like I said, I mean, this isn't necessarily a leasehold. I think it's the same as, I suppose there's more understanding around freehold, isn't there? So people are clearer on giving those sort of instructions to this is what's going to happen. I suppose it's getting a deeper understanding of what leasehold is and applying the same principles, because that's the bit. Because people sort of go into the unknown a little bit selling, they get frustrated with the delays. Well, why is my management company taking 6 weeks to respond,
Yeah.
or that sort of thing? If people are aware that these things are going to be problematic and we get ahead of it as much as we can, you can take some of the stresses away. I can't make a management company do things faster, but it's all about triggering these points earlier. But I agree with you. I mean, leasehold, the reform and the commentary around government seems to be that they're trying to reform leasehold with the view potentially, whether it's going to come or not, is leaning into common hold, which was something that was many years ago that never really took off. But we won't get into that today, so we'll be here forever. Most solicitors are not looking forward to that, I don't think. But I do think that they are trying to make it better and trying to get rid of what you said, people taking advantage of circumstances, increasing rent, stuff like that. But I think it's still on us as businesses to treat it the same as it is now, get ahead of things. But I do take your point. I think there is, we certainly do as a business, as a commercial angle, we do charge more for dealing with leasehold because ultimately the extra time we spend on it and the work we do has to be covered somewhere. That is exactly the same for every estate agent. Now, obviously, commercial decisions are commercial decisions, or whether it's something that people take away and do is up to them. But I would certainly review if you've got lots of leasehold in your pipeline, what is the impact? What's the financial impact?
It's that sound advice for anybody. Tony, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll have you back when we know the impact of the reforms and when you can tell us that it's all been solved.
Am
And
I
it's
not going to be retired by the time these reforms kick in, Dean?
no, no, no.
No,
We're
no.
gonna do it quicker. We're gonna do it quicker. But Tony, always great to catch up with you. Highly recommend that if I think where you guys are instrumental is keeping pipelines moving in one
Yeah,
way or another, whether that's your sales progression service and you're married together with the conveyancing side of things. You understand your craft really well and you're able to advise estate agents accordingly. And the feedback is phenomenal.
thank you very much.
Highly recommend people having a chat. And by the way, they're always lovely and helpful. And if you manage to catch them at a conference, chances are they've got some free chocolate for you as well. They do that well. Tony, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Cheers.